But Gregor had had no intention of frightening anyone, least of all his sister. All he had done was begin to turn round, so that he could go back into his room, although that was in itself quite startling, as his pain-racked condition meant that turning round required a great deal of effort, and he was using his head to help himself do it, repeatedly raising it and striking it against the floor. He stopped and looked round. They seemed to have realised his good intention, and had only been alarmed briefly. Now they all looked at him in unhappy silence. His mother lay in her chair with her legs stretched out and pressed against each other, her eyes nearly closed with exhaustion. His sister sat next to his father, with her arms around his neck.
"Maybe now they'll let me turn round,"
thought Gregor, and went back to work. He could not help panting loudly with the effort, and had sometimes to stop and take rest. No one was making him rush any more. Everything was left up to him. As soon as he had finally finished turning round, he began to move straight ahead. He was amazed at the great distance that separated him from the room, and could not understand how he had covered that distance in his weak state a little while before, and almost without noticing it. He concentrated on crawling as fast as he could, and hardly noticed that there was not a word, not any cry, from his family to distract him. He did not turn his head until he had reached the doorway. He did not turn it all the way round, as he felt his neck becoming stiff, but it was none the less enough to see that nothing behind him had changed. Only his sister had stood up. With his last glance he saw that his mother had now fallen completely asleep. He was hardly inside his room before the door was hurriedly shut, bolted, and locked. The sudden noise behind Gregor so startled him that his little legs collapsed under him. It was his sister who had been in so much of a rush. She had been standing there, waiting, and sprung forward lightly. Gregor had not heard her coming at all, and as she turned the key in the lock, she said loudly to her parents, "At last!"
"What now, then?"
Gregor asked himself, as he looked round in the darkness. He soon made the discovery that he could no longer move at all. This was no surprise to him. It seemed rather that being able to actually move around on those spindly little legs until then was unnatural. He also felt relatively comfortable. It is true that his entire body was aching, but the pain seemed to be slowly getting weaker and weaker, and would finally disappear altogether. He could already hardly feel the decayed apple in his back, or the inflamed area around it, which was entirely covered in white dust. If it was possible, he felt that he must go away even more strongly than his sister. He remained in this state of empty and peaceful rumination until he heard the clock tower strike 3 in the morning. He watched as it slowly began to get light everywhere outside the window too. Then, without his willing it, his head sank down completely, and his last breath flowed weakly from his nostrils. When the cleaner came early in the morning, they'd often asked her not to keep slamming the doors, but with her strength and in her hurry she still did, so that everyone in the flat knew when she'd arrived, and from then on it was impossible to sleep in peace. She made her usual brief look-in on Gregor, and at first found nothing special. She thought he was laying there so still on purpose, playing the martyr. She attributed all possible understanding to him. She happened to be holding the long broom in her hand, so she tried to tickle Gregor with it from the doorway. When she had no success with that, she tried to make a nuisance of herself and poked at him a little. And only when she found she could shove him across the floor with no resistance at all, did she start to pay attention. She soon realised what had really happened, opened her eyes wide, whistled to herself, but did not waste time to yank open the bedroom doors and shout loudly into the darkness of the bedrooms.
"Come and have a look at this! It's dead! Just lying there! Stone dead!"
Mr. and Mrs. Samsa sat upright there in their marriage bed, and had to make an effort to get over the shock caused by the cleaner before they could grasp what she was saying. But then, each from his own side, they hurried out of bed. Mr. Samsa threw the blanket over his shoulders. Mrs. Samsa just came out in her nightdress, and that is how they went into Gregor's room. On the way, they opened the door to the living room, where Greta had been sleeping since the three gentlemen had moved in. She was fully dressed as if she had never been asleep, and the paleness of her face seemed to confirm this.
"Dead?"
asked Mrs. Samsa, looking at the charwoman inquiringly, even though she could have checked for herself, and could have known it even without checking.
"That's what I said,"
replied the cleaner, and to prove it she gave Gregor's body another shove with the broom, sending it sideways across the floor. Mrs. Samsa made a movement as if she wanted to hold back the broom, but did not complete it. "Now then," said Mr. Samsa, "let's give thanks to God for that." He crossed himself, and the three women followed his example. Greta, who had not taken her eyes from the corpse, said,
"Just look how thin he was. He didn't eat anything for so long. The food came out again just the same as when it went in."
Gregor's body was indeed completely dried up and flat. They had not seen it until then, but now he was not lifted up on his little legs, nor did he do anything to make them look away.
"Greta, come with us in here for a little while," said Mrs. Samsa
with a pained smile, and Greta followed her parents into the bedroom, but not without looking back at the body. The cleaner shut the door and opened the window wide. Although it was still early in the morning, the fresh air had something of warmth mixed in with it. It was already the end of March, after all. The three gentlemen stepped out of their room and looked round in amazement for their breakfasts. They'd been forgotten about. "Where is our breakfast?" the middle gentleman asked the cleaner irritably. She just put her finger on her lips and made a quick and silent sign to the men that they might like to come into Gregor's room. They did so, and stood around Gregor's corpse with their hands in the pockets of their well-worn coats. It was now quite light in the room. Then the door of the bedroom opened, and Mr. Samsa appeared in his uniform, with his wife on one arm and his daughter on the other. All of them had been crying a little. Greta now and then pressed her face against her father's arm. "Leave my home, now," said Mr. Samsa, indicating the door and without letting the women from him. "What do you mean?" asked the middle of the three gentlemen, somewhat disconcerted, and he smiled sweetly. The other two held their hands behind their backs and continually rubbed them together in gleeful anticipation of a loud quarrel, which could only end in their favour. "I mean just what I said," answered Mr. Samsa, and, with his two companions, went in a straight line towards the man. At first he stood there still, looking at the ground, as if the contents of his head were rearranging themselves into new positions. "All right, we'll go then," he said, and looked up at Mr. Samsa as if he had been suddenly overcome with humility and wanted permission again from Mr. Samsa for his decision. Mr. Samsa merely opened his eyes wide and briefly nodded to him several times. At that, and without delay, the man actually did take long strides into the front hallway. His two friends had stopped rubbing their hands some time before and had been listening to what was being said. Now they jumped off after their friend, as if taken with a sudden fear that Mr. Samsa might go into the hallway in front of them and break the connection with their leader. Once there, all three took their hats from the stand, took their sticks from the holder, bowed without a word, and left the premises. Mr. Samsa and the two women followed them out onto the landing, but they had no reason to mistrust the men's intentions, and as they leaned over the landing, they saw how the three gentlemen made slow but steady progress down the many steps. As they turned the corner on each floor, they disappeared and would reappear a few moments later. The further down they went, the more that the Samsa family lost interest in them. When a butcher's boy, proud of posture with his tray on his head, passed them on his way up, and came nearer than they were, Mr. Samsa and the women came away from the landing and went, as if relieved, back into the flat. They decided the best way to make use of that day was for relaxation, and to go for a walk. Not only had they earned a break from work, but they were in serious need of it. So they sat at the table and wrote 3 letters of excusal, Mr. Samsa to his employers, Mrs. Samsa to her contractor, and Greta to her principal. The cleaner came in while they were writing, to tell them she was going. she finished her work for the morning. The three of them at first just nodded without looking up from what they were writing, and it was only then, when the cleaner did not seem to want to leave, that they looked up in irritation. "Well?" asked Mr. Samsa. The charwoman stood in the doorway with a smile on her face, as if she had some tremendous good news to report, but would only do it if she was clearly asked to. The almost vertical little ostrich feather on her hat, which had been a source of irritation to Mr. Samsa all the time she'd been working for them, swayed gently in all directions.
"What is it you want, then?"
asked Mrs. Samsa, whom the cleaner had the most respect for.
"Yes,"
she answered, and broke into a friendly laugh that made her unable to speak straight away.
"Well then, that thing in there, you needn't worry about how you're going to get rid of it. That's all been sorted."
Mrs. Samsa and Greta bent down over their letters, as if intent on continuing with what they were writing. Mr. Samsa saw that the cleaner wanted to start describing everything in detail, but, with outstretched hand, he made it quite clear that she was not to. So, as she was prevented from telling them all about it, she suddenly remembered what a hurry she was in, and, clearly peeved, called out, "Cheerio, then, everyone," turned round sharply, and left, slamming the door terribly as she went out. "Tonight she gets sacked," said Mr. Samsa, but he received no reply from either his wife or his daughter, as the charwoman seemed to have destroyed the peace they had only just gained. They got up and went over to the window, where they remained with their arms round each other. Mr. Samsa twisted round in his chair to look at them, and sat there watching for a while. Then he called out, "Come here, then. Let's forget about all that old stuff, shall we? Come and give me a bit of attention." The two women immediately did as he said, hurrying over to him, where they kissed him and hugged him, and then they quickly finished their letters. After that, the three of them left the flat together, which was something they'd not done for months, and took the tram out to the open country outside the town. They had the tram, filled with warm sunshine, all to themselves. Leant back comfortably on their seats, they discussed their prospects, and found that on closer examination they were not all that bad. Until then they'd never asked each other about their work, but all three had jobs which were very good, and held particularly good promise for the future. The greatest improvement for the time being, of course, would be achieved quite easily by moving house. What they needed now was a flat that was smaller and cheaper than the current one, which had been chosen by Gregor, one that was in a better location and, most of all, more practical. All the time, Greta was becoming livelier. With all the worry they'd been having of late, her cheeks had become pale, but while they were talking, Mr. and Mrs. Samsa were struck, almost simultaneously, with the thought of how their daughter was blossoming into a well-built and beautiful young lady. They became quieter. Just from each other's glance, and almost without knowing it, they agreed that it would soon be time to find a good man for her. And, as if in confirmation of their new dreams and good intentions, as soon as they reached their destination, Greta was the first to get up and stretch out her young body.